Hello everybody, my name is Putu Kanno, and today me and my group is going to present about the growth and development. So for the introductions, economists are increasingly concerned with the explanation of the per capita GDP levels and their rates of growth. For such explanations, economists turn to what is known as growth theory. In here, we consider two variants of growth theory. The first is old growth theory or the solo model. And the second is the new or endogenous growth theory. We also consider the interrelationship among human capital, trade, institutions, and growth. Growth theory with Growth theory began with Nobel laureate Robert Solow in 1956 in what is known as the old growth. As you can see here in the picture, this is Robert Solow. So the growth theory uses what economists usually call the production function. In particular, the intensive production function illustrated in the figure 21.1. This is the figure 21.1. The intensive production function relates two economic variables. The first is per capita GDP, denoted by Y equals Y divided by L, where Y is the GDP and the L is the labor force or populations. And the second is capital labor ratio, denoted by K equals the K divided by L, where K is the total amount of physical capital and the L is the same as before, the labor force or the population. In the figure 21.1, it indicates that there is a positive relationship between the capital labor ratio and the per capita GDP. As the capital-labor ratio increases and each worker has more physical capital to work with, per capita GDP increases. For example, as the capital-labor ratio increases from this part of K1 increase to the K2, and each of the workers has more physical capital to work with. So the per capita GDP increases from the Y1 into Y2. As you can see from the graph, you can see this curve that is formed, and this process is known as the capital deepening. This figure also indicates that the relationship between the capital labor ratio and the per capita GDP is decreasingly positive. How do you know if it's decreasingly positive? You can see it from the slope. The slope on the graph, it becomes flatter and flatter as it increases right here, right? You can see here it becomes more flatter. And this is the result of the diminishing returns to labor and capital. There is a set of other possible sources of increase in per capita income. This we refer to as shift factors because they shift the intensive production function as in figure 21.2 in here. Originally, Solow had referred to this technological change, but this turns out to be the only one of the set of potential shift factors. And as the result of the shift factors, at a given capital labor ratio, K1 per capita income increases from Y1 to DY2. The increases in per capita incomes can come about through increases in the capital labor ratio, or as I said before the capital deepening, or through other shift factors such as improvements in technological efficiency. So how fast can increases in capital-labor ratio or other shift factors make the economies grow? As you can see in table 21.1 right here, the growth rates in GDP per capita can differ significantly among countries and over time. The variation recorded in the table alone ranges from, let's say, from -6, -5, and until the 16%. It's important to keep in mind that when poor countries record a negative growth, poverty is most likely will be increasing in that country. And like in the case of Ghana, you can see here Ghana. You can see that in 1980, 1990, and 2000, the growth rate is very low, -2, 0, and 1. However, in 2010, it had increased to 5%. The process of capital deepening. Increase in K require increases in capital stock that more than offset any increases in population. Increases in the capital stock in turn require investment. And finally, investment will require savings. The relationship between saving and investment developed in chapter 13 was like this. In this formula like this. I equals to SH plus SG plus SF, or if we set it in words, it would be domestic investment equals this is the domestic savings plus the foreign savings. In the absence of shift factors such as technological improvements, increases in domestic and foreign savings are the only sources of growth in per capita incomes. Solo residuals. As presented in the figure 21.3 right here, the solo models leaves a lot to be explained. The double-headed arrow, you can see here the double-headed arrow in this diagram represents the amount of growth not accounted by the capital deepening, or in other words, is the unexplained growth. This is known as the solo residual. The new growth theory attempts to explain some of these solo residuals. And for the next part is going to be explained by my friend.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm going to be presenting about new growth theory and human capital. A number of new growth theory models emphasize the role of a third factor of production in addition to labor and physical capital, and it is human capital. And it is more than just about hours worked. It reflects skills, abilities, and education, and might even creativity in some sectors. There appears to be a positive link between human capital and technological efficiency, and with these considerations, it leads to some economists to modify the intensive production function so that increases in human capital shifted upward through a positive impact on technological efficiency. So levels of human capital can vary significantly among countries as over time, and it leads to the differences in technological efficiency, and it would also lead to differences in GDP per capita. So now let's take a look at the figure. This takes adult literacy as a measure of human capital for a range of years and for 5 developing regions. So outside of sub-Saharan Africa, adult literacy rates are on significant upward trend. However, they vary significantly from below 60% in the South Asia to 90% in the Latin America or Caribbean and East Asia or Pacific regions. So based on this view, the new growth theory is such differences can matter for technological efficiency, and it would matter in resulting different GDP per capita within these countries. So within this intensive production function of the new growth theory, Technology is an endogenous variable that can be influenced by levels of human capital. Now let's talk about how important is human capital. Early attempts to address this possibility indicated that human capital was important. Mankiw, Romer, and Weil 1992, and Hodge and Jones 1999, human capital in growth models can contribute to their ability to explain the variation in per capita incomes among the countries of the world. Now, there's also subsequent work that questioned the empirical importance of human capital as education in explaining development as growth. Easterly, 2001, the growth response to the dramatic educational expansion of the last 4 decades has been distinctly disappointing. If the incentives to invest in the future are not there, expanding education is worth little. Creating skills where there exists no technology to use them is not going to foster economic growth. So basically, back then, there's a lack of understanding of human capital, the relation of human capital with education and development of education, and also the growth of the country. So why did the seeming importance of human capital as education not show up as significant in empirical investigations? So some researchers already answered this, Kruger and Lindahl, 2001. It is difficult to establish the role of education in growth due to measurement errors. And then Cohen and Soto, 2007, managed to resolve the measurement error difficulties by establishing a nonlinear relationship between education and human capital. So by resolving the measurement error difficulties, they managed to find that education does contribute to development as growth. So further evidence on the importance of human capital in the form of education comes from research on the rate of return to education, or RORE, or RORE. So the first one, the private or market RORE, is generally higher than the rate of return on physical capital investments. And the second one, the private or market RORE, is generally higher at lower levels of education. The private or market RORE is generally higher at lower levels of GDP per capita. So there are numerous researchers who were focusing at female education who also suggest that the human capital of girls and women is particularly important. So for example, here we have a researcher, Schultz, 2002. There is a substantial empirical literature suggesting that adding to a mother's schooling will have a larger beneficial effect on child's health, schooling, and adult productivity than would adding to a father's schooling by the same amount. And also, we need to consider and recognize that human capital can also include health components. And we have another researcher by the name of Pio or Pio, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, 1994. Particular attention to the role of human capital with an emphasis on the adjective human, that is to say, on the levels of health, education, and nutrition of the population and the implications of changes in such levels for long-term growth. So if you see both of these approaches to human capital, the first one being the woman approach and then the health approach, both of these approaches actually connected somehow. So because of women's traditionally close relationship to children, it also turns out that the educational levels of women contribute positively and significantly to child's health. Of course, this refers to the hygiene and nutrition and childcare factors for the mediation of child's health. And with the work of Osmani and Sen, again, if I pronounced that wrong, sorry, 2003, women's deprivation in nutrition and health contributes to the ill health of offspring, both as children and as adults, through the pathway of fetal health. So basically, what the woman consumes or how she's taking care of herself will affect her child in the future. So So even the health of adults and consequently their capacity to work depends on the health of their mothers, as health outcomes are transmitted from one generation to the other. So this discussion of human capital in both education and health aspects or approaches in relation to growth suggests that there might be some important relationships among three components of the Human Development Index or HDI, and as you can see on the figure there. So, on this figure, education has a direct impact on the HDI through its one-third weight. However, it also can have an indirect impact on the HDI via its impact on human capital and thereby on per capita GDP. And health also has a direct impact on the HDI through its one-third weight and indirect impact also on the HDI through human capital and per capita GDP. And these indirect effects can be all the more powerful because, in addition, there is two-way positive interaction between education and health illustrated in the figure, and educated persons, particularly women, contribute to healthy children, and healthy children are more likely to become educated.
Hello everyone, I'm Valerie and I'm going to continue the presentation. Now I will explain about trade and growth. So, in general, trade has a positive and significant impact on economic growth, which is consistent with the evidence in the empirical literature. A 1% rise in the average trade to GDP ratio leads to an increase in the average GDP per capita growth. Also, many development economists and international trade economists have suggested that countries' openness to international trade has a positive impact on growth in per capita GDP and therefore on poverty alleviation and human development. Moving on the next slide, there is trade effects. The first one, increased exports can support increased employment and wage incomes, with the latter being invested in increases in human capital. The second one, increased trade, can in some circumstances improve competitive conditions in domestic markets. And the last one, exports can contribute to improved technological efficiency as a shift factor in the intensive production function diagram. The notion here is that technological efficiency responds to two impulses. The first one, impulse in domestic innovation, which is positively affected by human capital accumulation in some new growth theory models. And the second impulse is the absorption of new technology from the rest of the world. In this slide, on the right hand side, there is Ghana export externality. So the PG is Ghana autarky price and PW is the world price. In the absence of a positive export externality, as the price increased from PG to PW in the movement from autarky to trade, quantity supplied increased from point A to point B, and exports of EG1 appear. In the presence of export externalities, the process continues one step further. The initial export level, or EG1, facilitates the absorption of, of technological knowledge from abroad and the subsequent improvement in production technology makes possible an increase in supply or a shift in Ghana's supply curve from SG1 to SG2. And then, given PW, Ghanaian firms move from point B to point C and exports expand to EG2. So, in simplified form, this is how some international and development economists view the role of exports in development process. Moving in the next slide, there is institutions and growth. For the first category, there is rule of law. So, in the elements in political representation, elections and independent judiciary, civil liberties and consistency. The rule of law helps to prevent violent conflict and provides for legitimacy in political decision making. So, because conflict, either internal or external, involve productive asset destruction and is not good for growth, therefore, the use of rule of law is clearly relevant. Next category is property rights, concerns the ownership of productive assets that are involved in the growth and development process. The relevant elements here include secure ownership of control of assets, the right to return on these assets, and the distribution of the assets. Property rights ensures that the use of productive assets will result in appropriable returns that will in turn provide incentive for further development and use. Next, contract enforcement. So, because the market systems rely on complex sets of contracts with varying degrees of intertemporality, if the process of entering into and inciting from these contracts is not regularized, it will confuse. So the relevant elements here is include contract design, escape clauses for early exit, and legal resource in the case of contract violation. Contract enforcement allows for parties to enter into long-term productive arrangements with a minimum degree of certainty. And the fourth category is regulation. So, although the notion of regulation often has negative connotations, this area of government activity is actually essential for growth and development. Regulations have the purpose to address known market failures. It is important areas include in prudential regulation of finance to avoid the crisis, and microeconomic management and basic health and safety regulation. Finally, the last one is social insurance. So, this includes transport payments, employment practices, and traditional social arrangement. Traditional family and community social insurance systems tend to break down as growth and development proceed. As this occurs, they need to be replaced by other social insurance systems based on employment practices or transfer payment. Without this system, the changes of the market system can undermine its effectiveness in allocating resources, improving technological efficiency, and accumulating physical and human capital. So, social insurance ensures that the market dislocations are managed so as not to impede human development. That's all from me. For the conclusion of our presentation, we will explain by my friend.
So the conclusion for this chapter, it is clear that the accumulations of both physical and human capital are the causes of growth, and also the trade and institutions also two other potentially important explanatory variables that causes growth. And also it is important to keep an eye on human development and institutional development. And then if we want to view differently this chapter, you can see the linkages among the realms of international trade, international production, international finance, and international development that we have learned from the previous chapters of international economics. So the trade relationships of a country can result in the absorption of new technology, and this absorption can be facilitated by the accumulation of the appropriate types of human capital. And there are also potentially positive and also can be negative interactions between international production and international development. So these are the conclusion for the chapter. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and goodbye.